welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, and we're very glad that you're joining us again today. We are continuing with Dr. Stanislav Grof, the author of many books, most recently, The Cosmic Game, which is about the relationship of, as he was just telling me, perennial philosophy with people's personal experiences of their own psyche, which in a sense is all of our psyche, and how this relates to, you could say, the larger teachings that have been part of our planet's history for a long, long time. Stanislav Grof has been involved in the development of transpersonal psychology and is world-renowned for his breakthrough work in this field. And being among the leaders in this area, he has brought a tremendous new way of looking at psychology and psychiatry from his personal experiences, first of LSD and then on into other psychotropic, psychoactive substances. So we're very glad that you're joining us again, Stan.
Thank you again.
Absolutely. If we're going to just pick up where we kind of left off, perhaps we can go into what your work consists of these days. You've gotten involved in particular in developing something called holotropic breath work. What is the relationship of that to the work that you had done previously?
Well, it's basically working with the same dimensions of the psyche, only the method of eliciting them is non-pharmacological. My wife Christina and I developed this holotropic breath work as an alternative to psychedelic therapy.
An alternative to an alternative.
When it became increasingly difficult for political, administrative reasons to use psychedelics. Mm-hmm. So it's a very simple method. It just uses faster breathing that's a little deeper than usual, that ties inhalation to exhalation. And then we use powerful evocative music, much of it coming from various ethnic sources. Spiritual traditions,
world music.
Yeah, where native cultures developed actually sound technologies to change consciousness.
Absolutely.
So we use, for example, Aboriginal drumming rhythms from Africa, or Balinese trance-inducing music, or Sufi chanting, didgeridoo, Tibetan ritual music, and so on. And we also use a certain kind of bodywork when there are areas in the body that are blocked, that need somehow a release of energy. Mm-hmm. And we see basically people having experiences along the same spectrum that we used to see in psychedelic sessions. Some of them biographical, powerful experiences of psychospiritual death, rebirth, and then transpersonal experiences, which means past life experiences, or images of archetypal beings, or visits to archetypal realms, mystical experiences, identification with nature, identification with animals, and so on. The difference being that it's not so overwhelming. You have a different degree of control over those experiences.
Yes,
you actually have to work for it. It's not just swallowing a pill. Yeah.
Of course, that's one of the great graces of the plants too. So, as you're so familiar with the Eastern perspectives and wisdom teachings, one of the main practices of India, for example, is pranayama. What is the difference? Is there a difference between holotropic breathing and the pranayama practices from India?
There's quite a bit of difference. The pranayama is very intense, sort of use of breath, for example, forceful breathing, alternatives through nostrils, and it involves the prolonged withholding of breath, and so on. Whereas actually what impresses us is how easy it is to get to these experiences without a particular effort. Christina and I did about 30 month-long workshops at Esalen. And so we experimented with different forms of breathing exercises, some of them coming from humanistic psychology, from the Neo-Reichian, Reiki and Neo-Reichian techniques.
Like bioenergetics.
Yeah, we had some, yogis, some Indian teachers, some Tibetan teachers, and so on. So we have experimented with a number of these techniques. And it's like in psychology, we have many schools, and each school gives you different instructions. There's a different concept as to how the psyche functions, why the symptom develops, and then it gives you a different technique that you have to learn. And it's the same with breath. I mean, some of the systems they tell you have to breathe from the tips of the lungs, others tell you, use deep diaphragmatic breathing, and some of these systems, as I mentioned, tells you, how you alternate the nostrils and so on, or alternate hyperventilation with withholding breath.
So are you, in a sense, just encouraging people through your workshops to just do fairly normal but slightly deeper breathing? And
well, yes, the basic philosophy, the basic principle of the whole holotropic therapy is, unlike some of the other therapeutic systems, is that we work with the inner healing intelligence rather than this being a result of some kind of interventions. We try to mobilize the inner healer. The idea is that there is something within you that knows better than any school or any individual therapist what you need. And so even with the breathing, we sort of ultimately ask people to follow the inner guidance. So they start by just breathing a little faster, little deeper than usual, the attention shifted from the head to the breath, and then once they get into the process, then you simply follow the inner guidance, even to the point that at some part of the session you might discover that actually slowing down the breathing temporarily takes you deeper.
I see. Well, another thing I'm reminded of course, is the area of rebirthing. And Leonard Orr and later Sandra Ray, people who have been doing this kind of work for many, many years. Is this different than that? And if so, how?
Well, there are quite a few differences. The closest thing, of course, we both work with breathing, with faster breathing. But in rebirthing, at least the classical rebirthing, the different rebirthers who have their own modifications and so on. But the classical one involved coaching. Like the rebirther knows how the person should breathe, so would be told how to breathe at certain period, which is different from following your inner guidance. We sort of really, very systematically encourage the using the inner wisdom. So there's that difference in the breathing. The other major difference is traditional rebirthing does not use music. And in our approach, the music is an extremely important part.
I see.
And as I mentioned, we draw on traditions that actually use music to induce trance. And classical rebirthing does not have the body work that we're using. When the breathing doesn't resolve something, we have a certain body work that we use. And then what the major difference, of course, is the theoretical framework. I have no problems, with reversing as a practical technique. It's a very, very powerful technique.
Yes,
and if it's an alternative, talk about your problems or do reversing, I certainly would recommend reversing anytime. But I have difficulties with what Leonard did with it theoretically, putting it in language that is very difficult for a professionally trained person to accept. Talking in terms of confronting the 5 biggies, and believing that you become immortal if you do this breathing,
and physical immortality,
and use of the affirmations and so on. So my effort was to link it to transpersonal psychology, and then from there to the emerging paradigms. Obviously, it still will be acceptable only to people who are very open-minded, who are sort of not committed to the traditional way of thinking. So it still stretches, somehow the conceptual frameworks, but it's written, it's put in a framework that a professional can follow or can accept.
Totally burst the bubble, so to speak.
Yeah, I think many professionals like psychiatrists, psychologists actually ended up doing reversing, but it was in spite of other than because of the theory. It's because the practical effect is really impressive.
Yeah. Now, I'm reminded, well, first of all, since you brought up immortality, which happens to be one of my favorite subjects, I can't resist asking you, when you, having done the study that you've done and having had the experience you've had, and both personally as well as clinically, and observing thousands upon thousands of people having these experiences, what conclusion do you draw, if any, about the nature of immortality? After all, immortality, in a sense, you could say, is really the quintessence. I mean, we speak about enlightenment, you know, in the East, in Buddhism and Hinduism, and many of the other practices. And Taoism actually really lays out not just immortality, but physical immortality as a true possibility for someone to bring their physical body and to make it, you know, basically disappear and reappear at will. And there have been many yogis who've done this also, that the body is truly just one level of their reality, which we know, and they have the ability, having developed this, to manifest it or disappear it like that.
Well,
What
you
is
see,
your
well, I had medical training,
reading of
traditional psychiatric training, and it was in a Marxist, you know, controlled country.
Sure.
So where I started was, I mean, you know, you're a body, you have a brain. Consciousness is consciousness is the product of the neurophysiological processes. So when the body dies, the brain dies. That's it.
Yes.
And it was very clear to me. Now, after 40 years of working with non-ordinary states, I am really open, certainly, to the possibility that consciousness does not end, you know, with physical demise.
Sure.
We had years ago we had a conference sponsored or at least inspired by Claiborne Pell, the U.S. Senator, which was at Georgetown University in Washington, on survival of consciousness after death. People academically trained like Charlie Tart and Rupert Sheldrake and myself, you know, discussing with Tibetan lamas and so on. Seriously, what evidence do we have, or what indication that this is possible? And I think it's very, very plausible. We certainly have out-of-body experiences in near-death situations, or even outside of near-death situations.
Oh, yes.
Showing that consciousness can do things that the brain cannot do. And if consciousness can operate independently of the brain while the body is still alive, why not after death? We have observations, you know, suggesting reincarnation. The Ian Stevenson study of past life experiences in children, or experiences of adults that can be confirmed. So there's just a vast sort of area of observations suggesting that possibility. Now, in terms of physical, so this is the immortality of consciousness, and
So you yourself feel
I'm certainly open to that. Yeah.
that. Yeah.
I
mean,
believe
when you make your own personal intelligent inferences based on this vast body of information, you really do come to the conclusion that reincarnation is real, and that consciousness is certainly not limited to the functioning of the brain system, no matter how amazing it may be.
Well, for example, reincarnation is one of the reasonable inferences from the unusual material that we have in terms of experiences, observations. It's not necessarily the only one. For example, in the book, The Cosmic Game, I give an alternative,
Let's show this to people.
which actually in India, you know, believing in reincarnation of the same unit of consciousness over lifetimes would be seen as a very primitive, very popular interpretation of this evidence.
Right.
The highest yogic teaching is there's only one entity that incarnates, which is Brahman. If you have a story that has more than one, you're still under the influence of Maya. You have to go further. So what I'm saying is there is impressive sort of evidence from which you can draw that kind of conclusion. But that's a theory that certainly accounts for those observations. And to me, it's much superior to what you find in academic psychiatry or psychology, where the idea is that it's a bunch of nonsense. Those people either don't know what we're talking about, they're not familiar with the evidence, or they have sort of poo-pooed it, you know.
Sure.
Or if they know the evidence and don't think there is something interesting there,
Sure.
to study. It's very peculiar to me.
Well, it's funny. I know that you didn't answer the part about the physical thing, but
Yeah.
I have a feeling it remains possibly plausible. But just because time is running so short, Stan, I want to ask you another question that's really kind of an interface of the breath work with the ancient Indian tradition in particular, and it also relates to the subject of death. And that is, in some of the Indian traditions, the yogic traditions, there is this state that some yogis have been in, some of whom we've had on the show, that is called a breathless state, and it's a pulseless state. And they enter into this state and are fully alive, though appear to be dead.
Yeah, sure.
And in fact, and then if you go over to the Taoists, you have people that they stop breathing through their lung system, the respiratory system, and they breathe primarily through their bones, in particular their spine. So I was just wondering how your work, the holotropic breath work, may relate to these kind of unusual, but also
Yeah, well, I'm
database
certainly,
experiences.
familiar with the Tibetan and the Indian evidence, for very, very extraordinary things,
Yes.
materialization, dematerialization, and I'm quite open to it because I know that even today, I'm at least halfway in that direction based on my own observations. There are things I haven't seen. I haven't seen levitation. But we ridicule things like the bardo body, that after you die, your bardo body can travel all the world and a perception, of any part of the globe and so on. And these things have been confirmed. So the question is, what are the other areas where we sort of deny something that is possible? We denied. Yeah, we laughed at the possibility of firewalking. I have done firewalking,
Myself as well.
Yeah.
Sure.
And so I think it goes much further.
Yes.
But for some of these, I would have to go really to the cosmic game and there's a good possibility, good evidence for that actually what we are experiencing in this world is made of consciousness. It's virtual reality. It's orchestration of experiences. And 20 years from now, when virtual reality is perfected, it will be much clearer to us that you can experience realities that are not there. So if it's really consciousness, not sort of a material world run by some kind of fixed laws, then there is no reason why some of these things couldn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like the movies. I mean, in Hollywood, the people control your experiences, so they can give you anything.
Sure. You see, I really think you never left the animated film world.
Yeah.
Just appears that.
Yeah, there are a lot of references in the cosmic game, showing the parallelism. The Hindus talk about this world as being lila, as being the divine play of consciousness. And I think it's a very, very plausible way of looking at things.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you very much again, Stan, for coming by and sitting with us for the
Again,
show.
well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure, really.
Okay.
And continue your wonderful work. I love the way you were just expanding the paradigm of our traditional, I would say actually, conventional way of thinking in the field of psychology and psychiatry. It's just, it needs people like you with the kind of background that you've got to just blow open the barriers, because it's in need of reformation. And
Well, thank you.
we appreciate what you're doing. Sure.
Thanks.
This is Mitchell J. Rabin. Thanks so much for joining us. And in the last few minutes of the show, I'll be speaking with you about my actual experience of doing Stan's holotropic breath work, as a workshop is being sponsored by the Open Center this weekend in New York. So stay tuned for that, and I'll be seeing you soon. Just hello. For a commentary after the weekend with Stanislav Grof and doing the holotropic breath work, the workshop sponsored by the Open Center here in New York, it leads me to express a number of different sentiments that arose in me
during the workshop. I'll be very frank and open with you about my experience. I feel that the work is very powerful. The weekend for me brought up a number of different things. I felt it afforded me an opportunity to deepen my experience of myself, to enter a space of great quietude, deep relaxation, and as it were, I was venting or ventilating much of my insides. And you would think that would naturally occur from such emphasis on breath. Well, it did. The context was a large, very lovely space on the west side with probably around 80 or 90 people. They were divided into two groups, the breathers and the sitters. The breathers, well, that's easy. The breathers were to lie down in a comfortable position on a blanket of some sort and breathe. And breathe virtually normally, but with some emphasis on depth and rapidity. And there wasn't much instruction in this regard. One was to do what one felt comfortable with. And we did. And beside each breather was a sitter. And the sitter's job was to solely attend to the breather. That means if there was a need for water, if there was a need for a touch, if there was a need for some form of attention, be it momentary dialogue, anything could be contracted between the breather and the sitter based on what the breather felt was his or her needs that may arise during the course of a 3-hour breathing session. So everyone picked, in one way or another, a partner for the weekend, and a contract was set between the two, and on it went. One day, one breathed and the other sat. The other day, the other sat and the other breathed. So it was a very fair reciprocity. In my case, not only did I have the wonderful opportunity to have a lovely woman, Rena, who was working with me as my partner for the weekend, but I found the entire atmosphere, the room itself, very comfortable, and the music, selection of indigenous world music pieces were incredibly, for the most part, uplifting and stimulating on no doubt some primordial level. I was, however, disconcerted by a couple of the ongoing activities in the room while accessing great depth. Specifically, we were all, well, I guess 40 or 50 of us, lying down, breathing, and focusing very quietly, very much as in zazen, or any kind of deep meditative practice, except prostrate. And one would hear sounds, human sounds, sometimes animal sounds, around in the general ambient atmosphere of one's neighbors, distant or near. And then sometimes one would hear kind of jumping, it sounded, or pounding on the ground. And this seemed to be emerging from whatever their experience was in the breathing. Whatever it is they were accessing, somehow or another prompted them to express it, rather verbally and often loudly, and sometimes physically. And for myself, while I love being sometimes loud, certainly verbal, and often physical, in that situation, I'm given to going deep, as I have done many times in a meditative practice. And I've equated the depth coming from breathing and connecting to breathing to that kind of headset. So in the situation where people were, in a sense, acting as though we were in a primal scream session or primal therapy session, well, let's say some people called it holotropic primal scream. While it may have been appropriate for that kind of context, in my estimation, being where I was and certainly the way I was approaching it, let me own it that way, it did not feel appropriate. And I was encouraged to, when I spoke about this, to integrate the sounds and the movement, whatever I was sensing in the atmosphere around me, to integrate that into my experience as the field of my experience. Well, theoretically, that may be possible, but practically, it's very difficult. And it has merit, by all means. It's a very sensible and practical point of view. And for some, it could act as further evocation or provocation for them to connect to something even deeper. Totally possible. But for me, that wasn't happening. And for me, it was bringing me closer to the surface rather than the depth. And so my feeling is that there ought to be two kinds of holotropic breath workshops. One in which people approach it as a form of meditation, except in a perhaps different position and focusing very intently on the breath. And another where people can, if they feel so moved, no pun intended, move and speak or sing or express verbally or musically or however they feel moved to express, to do so. That would work better for me. So much resides in a name and how and by what name we do call things. So for me, while the experience was quite deep, and especially I noticed for myself during the Tibetan music that was being played, the chants, I found myself going into a state that I wouldn't call quite the same as has been induced through different kinds of psychoactive plants, but certainly comparable to an incredibly deep meditation where I was starting to feel like I was connecting to a real primordial space, archetypal, if you will. So value was had by me, and I feel that there is great value in consciously connecting to one's breathing. After all, breathing is our daily etheric food, if you will. It's what is coming in and going out of us by the moment. More physical food comes into us, whatever, a couple of times a day. But air, oxygen is coming in constantly. Now, I'm reminded of some of the wisdom that was spoken through Uspensky by Gurdjieff in talking about how when we breathe consciously, we extract elements from the air that are not ordinarily available to us in our unconscious state. So using that in a sense as a model for what could be possible, in a sense receiving rarefied gases that can then inform our cellular structure to bring us to a level of, may I say it, atomic reality, wherein the structure of our atoms, the spin of the electron, is shifted from its normal operating state to, I'll say, a more elevated, a loftier, a more spacious state. And while I cannot describe all of the physics in detail by any means, I'm using a bit more of a poetic way of expressing something that a physicist could take and express more articulately in the language of physics. It's as though there are different shelves, and we do talk about that in the periodic table and when we look at atomic structures, that there are different shelves, there are different layers, there are certainly different orbits. And it's as though through the breath work we are linking in to those subtler levels which carry us into a subtler level of consciousness. There we go. That's what I meant. And so the holotropic breath work altogether, I think has very powerful merit and value. So from that point of view, I think that the work that Stan Grof is doing is formidable, and he has a particular wonderful breadth of experience and knowledge that when he speaks about breath in the context of the larger whole of our psychology, in particular our transpersonal psychology, it rings so true because he is so masterful at his understanding and articulating, you could say, the archetypal realities we experience on this plane. And for that, I greatly appreciate. While I would make some changes myself, given that opportunity, as I've discussed, certainly I would do so. Other than that, I feel that the work is helping a lot of people, and I feel that because of what I observed. I notice people going through very powerful experiences, and God bless them. I think it's wonderful, highly therapeutic, and certainly an excellent path to self-discovery. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.